Well, good morning. It is Friday, May 15th. I am Heather E. Clausen, and I am the pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church and the United Methodist Church, both in Herman, Minnesota. In a few moments, I'm going to be reading to you, from the book of Acts, chapter 17, beginning at verse 22. I want to take a few moments to talk about this book of Scripture. Acts is said to be written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And we see Acts very much as the unfolding story of the early believers. It begins with those post appearances and then continues on with how those early believers, those disciples and the many others, lived out and also spread this faith in Jesus to those who were followers, those who would become followers. It is a very exciting and it is a very challenging book of Scripture. It is about how they needed to be more secure in their understanding of faith. It begins as directed to someone named Theophilus. And there's a lot of speculation about that. Was Theophilus a real person? Or was it a metaphor when you translate it as dear to God for new believers? But there are many who believe that Theophilus was both more than likely a benefactor of the early church, which made this writing possible, and also someone who needed to hear and be more secure in their faith, and for all the others who would overhear this. And in this book of Acts, we have many exciting stories of the challenges that were faced, of some of the amazing moments that they achieved. We also know that within these words is that unfolding story of Paul. Saul, who would become Paul and would become one of the most important missionaries for the early church. So let me share with you from Acts 17, beginning at verse 22. Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said." So Paul begins this discourse in these sections of the book of Acts that are very much about the expanding mission, the expanding reach of these teachings of Jesus, the expanding growth of the followers of Jesus. And he comes from the point of acknowledging who they are and that faith, belief is important to them. He finds it as evidenced in some of the things that we might tell them to get rid of. Instead, he uses some of those idols. He uses this one statue that speaks to an unknown God to reach them with the knowledge of who that God is. And he makes clear in these verses, as this piece that I shared this morning, he makes clear that this God is the one who doesn't need human help, who doesn't need the types of things that some of the other deities might need. But he is the creator, the one who brings about all that they have and all that they see and all that they are. And he shares with them that God, this unknown God, he is naming to them, because it is not a God who will live in a shrine and, of course, be controlled by humans. It is a skill that we often see in Paul. His words in another location say, "I will be all things to all people for the gospel of Jesus Christ." He's not being a hypocrite. What he is saying is, I will get to know the people. I will understand and hear their stories. And by doing that, by paying attention to what has formed them to this point, what matters to them, through that, I will be able to teach and share so that they will know. You know, there are many surveys done in our country, lots and lots of surveys. And Barna is one of the agencies that does many surveys, and many that are faith related. And they have done surveys asking about whether you believe in God. Over and over again, in those surveys, people will say yes. And in the unfolding questions of the surveys, it has begun to be apparent to them and to many others who do these surveys that often that belief seems to have or become less important in daily life. It is an orientation, but it doesn't always filter down. So these words in Acts this morning, what do they mean to us in our everyday life, in our living? What do they mean to us in this time of COVID-19? Well, I've been to many webinars, many Zoom meetings, and one yesterday made an interesting comment. It said, "Never waste a crisis." Really? And then I thought about it. It's changing, isn't it? We're innovating. We're understanding that it isn't just people who walk through the doors of a church and sit down in a pew that are those who hold faith. We're finding that innovating, reaching out even through Facebook, through YouTube, that we are finding that there are many, many, many more who today need, want to hear about that which gives a foundation and helps the world make sense. We are finding in the midst of this COVID-19, as we are a scattered church, often as it was back in the time of Acts, where it was this community and that community and this travel they'd do and this group of people they'd influence. It was a scattered church. We are a scattered church. We are people who name the unknown God. We are scattered and given more opportunities to enter into people's lives, to enter into their fear and their pain and their uncertainty. Not to tell them that they're wrong, not to tell them that they need to walk through the doors of a church, but to truly share with them the foundation that carries us through this time, that helps us keep going one step after another. But I do think we need to acknowledge that this is also a time of grief. It is a challenge to think that things will never be the same again. And to be honest, they won't. Outside of the church, inside of the church, how we do church, how we gather together, how we believe together, how we study together, it's going to be different. And we need to acknowledge that that is hard. And we need to grieve what has been, what we have always known, before we are ready to move into this new place that God is taking us, this new invitation that God is giving us to possibilities that we never really thought of. Paul spoke to these Greek people and was speaking into an invitation to a place of change, framing it around, I have an answer to the question that you are asking. I have an answer that has been given to me. It is not mine, but mine to deliver. And in that time and in our time today, we have to acknowledge that even when that answer is the truth, it is the ways in which we will express it. It's the ways we will form and meet that are changing. Not the bottom line. Not the foundation. Not the God we know through Jesus Christ. That remains unchanged. But there is an invitation beyond the grief, beyond our lament at what we are leaving behind, what we have become used to and comfortable to. There is within that this invitation from God to say, look, I'm inviting you to a new way of being. A new way of taking what is unchanging, but expressing it in new ways. We have become a virtual church. And even when the doors can reopen and we can gather, we will continue to be a virtual church, because it is an invitation from God to reach in a missionary way people who are asking the questions about how a life makes sense. What is that foundation I can count upon when nothing else seems to be remaining the same? Change is a challenge. Doing things differently can be hard. But when we realize that the foundation of God is not changing, that will never change. When we can allow ourselves to grieve what has been, then we are prepared for what can be. That is the invitation we are receiving now, to begin to think of new ways, just as those early disciples had to do, just as Paul had to do in framing his conversation with those Greek listeners. We need to learn new ways to share the old message. Go in peace and be blessed today. Amen.